There's no betrayal deeper than the one that comes from family. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the very ones who destroy your world. In 1847, 17-year-old Sarah Mae Henderson learned this truth when her father sold her to pay his gambling debts. She was chained in a wagon with other captives, heading toward a fate worse than death. But in the Colorado mountains lived a man named Ezekiel Stone. He was a mountain man who kept to himself and trusted no one. When he found that wagon and saw what was inside, everything changed. He had two choices: walk away and forget what he saw, or risk his life to save a stranger. What he decided would change both their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Bitter Creek, a trading post settlement that had grown like a weed in the harsh Colorado Territory soil. Sarah Mae Henderson stood at the cracked window of Murphy's General Store, her fingers tracing the edges of her mother's silver locket, the only treasure she had left in this world. The delicate piece of jewelry felt warm against her palm, containing the tiny portrait of a woman whose gentle eyes seemed to offer comfort even in death. Sarah Mae, "Quit your daydreaming and help me with these supplies," her father called from behind the counter, his voice carrying that familiar edge of irritation that had grown sharper with each passing month. Thomas Henderson had once been a proud man, a farmer who'd worked his hands raw to provide for his family. But that was before the drought took their crops, before her mother died of fever, and before the cards and dice became his only companions in the long, lonely nights. She turned from the window, tucking the locket beneath her worn calico dress. At 17, Sarah had her mother's auburn hair and determined chin, but her eyes held a wariness that shouldn't have belonged to someone so young. The past year had aged her in ways that time alone never could. She'd watched her father drink away their remaining savings, seen him disappear for days at gambling tables in the back rooms of saloons, and listened to him make promises he couldn't keep to men whose patience had long since worn thin. "The Hendersons always pay their debts," he told her just last week, but his hands shook as he said it. And Sarah knew that whatever money they'd managed to scrape together wouldn't be nearly enough. Murphy, the store owner, was a grizzled man in his 60s who'd seen enough frontier hardship to recognize trouble when it walked through his door. He glanced at Thomas with a mixture of pity and concern as he counted out the meager supplies they could afford: flour, beans, and a small portion of salt pork that would have to last them the rest of the month. "Tom, you know I'd extend you credit if I could," Murphy said quietly, "but these are hard times for all of us. The supply wagons from Denver are getting robbed more often than not, and I got my own debts to worry about." Thomas nodded curtly, avoiding Sarah's eyes. She could see the shame burning in his weathered face, the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of his failures. There had been a time when her father stood tall and proud, when neighbors sought his advice on crops and weather, when her mother would smile at him across their dinner table like he was the finest man who ever lived. Those days felt like stories from someone else's life now. As they loaded their supplies into the back of their wagon, Sarah noticed 3 men lounging near the hitching post. They weren't locals. She knew every face in Bitter Creek, and something about the way they watched her father made her skin crawl. The tallest one, a man with pale eyes and a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, tipped his hat in Thomas's direction. Her father's face went white as fresh snow. "Pa, who are those men?" Sarah asked as they climbed onto the wagon seat. "Nobody you need to concern yourself with," Thomas replied, but his voice lacked conviction. His hands trembled as he took up the reins, and Sarah noticed sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. The ride back to their small farm was conducted in tense silence. Sarah watched the familiar landscape roll by, the rolling hills dotted with scrub oak, the distant peaks of the Rockies still capped with snow even in late spring, the small creek that wound its way through their property like a silver ribbon. This land had been in her mother's family for 2 generations, and Sarah had always assumed it would be hers someday, that she'd raise her own children here under these endless Colorado skies. But as they pulled up to their modest cabin, she saw the three men from town already waiting in their yard. Their horses were fine animals, well-fed and well-cared for, suggesting these weren't ordinary drifters or cowboys looking for work. The scarred man stepped forward as Thomas climbed down from the wagon, his movements careful and deliberate. "Mr. Henderson," the man said, his voice smooth as silk, but with an underlying hardness that made Sarah's blood run cold. "I believe we have some business to discuss." Thomas's shoulders slumped further, and Sarah saw him reach into his pocket to pull out a crumpled piece of paper, a note covered in his own shaky handwriting. "I know why you're here, Crenshaw, but I need more time. Just another week, maybe 2, and I can get you the money." The man called Crenshaw smiled, but it was the kind of smile a wolf might give to a wounded deer. "Time, Mr. Henderson, is the one thing you don't have. The debt was due 3 days ago, and my employer is not known for his patience." His pale eyes shifted to Sarah, who was still sitting on the wagon seat, frozen with a growing sense of dread. "However, I believe we can work out an alternative arrangement." "No," the word came out of Thomas's mouth like a gunshot, sharp and desperate. "We agreed on money." "I'll get you the money." "With what?" Crenshaw asked, gesturing at the modest farm around them. "This land isn't worth half of what you owe, and we both know you don't have any other assets." His gaze returned to Sarah, and she felt like a piece of livestock being appraised at market. "Except, of course, for your daughter." Sarah's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She tried to speak, to protest, to demand an explanation, but no words came. She could only stare at her father, waiting for him to tell this horrible man to leave their property, to defend her honor, to be the father she remembered from her childhood. Instead, Thomas Henderson looked at his boots and said nothing. "She's young, healthy, and quite pretty," Crenshaw continued, his voice taking on the tone of a businessman discussing a transaction. "There are men in California who pay very well for such companionship. The trip west is dangerous, certainly, but the profits are substantial enough to cover your debts and then some." "She's my daughter," Thomas whispered. But even Sarah could hear the defeat in his voice. "And she's also your responsibility," Crenshaw replied coldly. "You made choices, Mr. Henderson. You sat at those card tables. You made those bets. You borrowed money from people who don't forgive debts. Now you have to live with the consequences." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Unless, of course, you prefer the alternative we discussed." Thomas's face crumpled like an old paper bag. Sarah had heard whispers around town about what happened to men who couldn't pay their gambling debts to certain creditors. Some disappeared entirely. Others were found in alleys or along remote stretches of road, beaten beyond recognition or worse. She realized with growing horror that her father wasn't just protecting himself, he was protecting her younger siblings, back east with their aunt. "Pa?" Sarah's voice came out small and frightened, like the child she'd been forced to stop being far too soon. Thomas looked up at her then, and Sarah saw tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. In that moment, she understood that her father was already gone, replaced by a broken man who saw no other way out of the hole he dug for both of them. The crumpled debt note in his hand fluttered in the breeze like a white flag of surrender, and Sarah knew that her life as she'd known it was about to end. The mother's locket around her neck suddenly felt heavier, as if it were pulling her down into darkness she couldn't yet imagine. 3 days later, Sarah found herself shackled in the back of a canvas-covered wagon, her wrists raw from the iron manacles that bound her to 4 other women. The wagon lurched and bounced over the rough mountain trail, each jolt sending waves of pain through her bruised body. She clutched her mother's locket with her bound hands, the only comfort left to her in this nightmare that had become her reality. The other women ranged in age, from barely 15 to perhaps 30, all sharing the same hollow-eyed look of those who had lost everything. They rarely spoke, communicating mostly through glances and small gestures of comfort when one of them wept. Sarah had learned their names over the past few days. Mary, a farmer's daughter sold to pay for her family's medical bills. Elena, a Mexican woman whose husband had been killed and whose children had been taken. Ruth, who refused to say how she'd ended up here but bore scars that spoke of unspeakable violence. And Jenny, the youngest, who cried constantly for her mother. Crenshaw rode alongside the wagon on his fine horse, occasionally calling back crude jokes to the driver. A heavy-set man named Pike, who smelled of whiskey and unwashed clothes. Behind them rode two more men, both armed and watchful for any sign of pursuit or rescue that Sarah knew would never come. The mountain air was thin and cold, even in late spring, and Sarah could see her breath when she exhaled. Through gaps in the wagon's canvas cover, she caught glimpses of towering pine trees and snow-capped peaks that stretched endlessly into the distance. This was beautiful country, the kind of wilderness her mother used to describe in stories of adventure and freedom. Now it felt like a prison, whose walls were made of stone and sky, high above them, hidden among the rocky outcroppings and dense forest. Ezekiel Stone watched the wagon train wind its way along the narrow mountain path. He had been tracking an elk for the better part of the morning when he'd first heard the sound of wheels and voices carrying through the thin air. Something about the group had struck him as wrong from the beginning. Legitimate travelers usually made more noise, called out to each other, sang songs to pass the time. This group moved with the quiet efficiency of men conducting business they didn't want witnessed. Ezekiel was a man shaped by solitude and hardship. At 35, he stood 6 feet tall with shoulders broadened by years of splitting wood, hauling water, and wrestling with the countless challenges of mountain living. His dark hair hung to his shoulders, and a full beard covered a face that had been weathered by wind and sun into the color of old leather. His clothes were practical: buckskin pants, a heavy wool shirt, and a coat he'd sewn himself from the hide of a bear that had threatened his cabin 2 winters ago. But it was his eyes that would have given a careful observer pause. They were the pale blue of winter ice, and they held the kind of watchfulness that came from years of living where a moment's inattention could mean death. Ezekiel had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was telling him that something evil was happening on the trail below. He moved through the forest like a ghost, using skills learned first as a child from his Cherokee grandmother, and later perfected during his years as a cavalry scout. His moccasins made no sound on the forest floor, and he knew how to use shadow and cover to remain invisible even in daylight. These were abilities that had kept him alive through Indian wars, cavalry charges, and the kind of frontier violence that most men couldn't imagine. When he finally got close enough to see the wagon clearly, what he witnessed made his blood run cold. Through a gap in the canvas, he could see the chained women, their faces etched with despair and terror. One of them, a young woman with auburn hair, looked up at that moment, and their eyes met across the distance. Even from where he crouched, Ezekiel could see the plea for help in her gaze, the desperate hope that somehow someone might care enough to intervene. That look hit him like a physical blow. It reminded him of another pair of eyes, another plea for help that he'd been too late to answer. His hand moved instinctively to the hunting knife at his belt, a blade that had belonged to his father and his father before him. The worn leather handle fit his grip like it had been made for him, and he could feel the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. For 5 years, Ezekiel had lived alone in these mountains, avoiding human contact whenever possible. He'd come here to escape the memories of war, the faces of men he'd killed, the weight of decisions that had cost good soldiers their lives. He'd told himself that solitude was peace, that isolation was safety, that caring about others only led to pain and failure. But looking at that wagon full of human misery, he knew his days of hiding were over. The trail ahead curved around a steep rocky outcropping before descending into a narrow valley. Ezekiel knew this country better than any man alive, and he understood that if he was going to act, it would have to be soon. Once the wagon reached the lower elevations, there would be too many places for the men to take cover, too many escape routes if things went wrong. He counted the odds carefully: 5 armed men against 1. But he had the advantage of surprise and intimate knowledge of the terrain. More importantly, he had motivation burning in his chest like a forge fire. Those women deserved better than whatever fate awaited them, and the young woman with the auburn hair deserved a chance at the kind of life that had been stolen from her. Ezekiel spent the next hour moving ahead of the wagon, setting up his ambush at a place where the trail narrowed between two large boulders. It was a natural choke point where the wagon would have to slow down and where the rocky terrain would limit the men's ability to maneuver. He checked his rifle, a .50 caliber Sharps that could drop a buffalo at 200 yards, and made sure his knife was loose in its sheath. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the wagon rounded the bend and entered the narrow passage. Ezekiel took a deep breath, said a prayer to whatever gods might be listening, and stepped out from behind the boulder with his rifle raised. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Release those women and ride away, and nobody has to die today." Crenshaw's hand moved toward his pistol, but froze when he saw the unwavering barrel of Ezekiel's rifle pointed directly at his chest. The other men reached for their weapons, but Ezekiel's voice cut through their movements like a blade. "I wouldn't recommend it," he said calmly. "This rifle will put a hole through a man big enough to throw a cat through, and I haven't missed a shot in over 10 years. His pale eyes moved from man to man, measuring their resolve, calculating their next moves. "The question you need to ask yourselves is whether those women are worth dying for." Pike, the wagon driver, was the first to speak, his voice shaky with fear and whiskey. "Mister, you don't know what you're getting into here. These women are bought and paid for, legal as can be. We got papers." "I don't care about your papers," Ezekiel interrupted. "I care about what's right, and selling human beings isn't right by any measure I know." He took a step closer, and Sarah could see the deadly certainty in his movements. "Now unlock those chains and let them go." In the wagon, Sarah felt her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. This stranger, this mountain man who looked like he'd stepped out of one of her mother's adventure stories, was risking his life for women he didn't even know. It was the first act of genuine kindness she'd witnessed since this nightmare began, and tears of relief and gratitude streamed down her face. Crenshaw's scarred face twisted into a sneer. "1 man against 5, stranger. I don't like those odds for you." Ezekiel smiled, but it was a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Neither do I," he admitted. "That's why I brought friends." As if summoned by his words, a low growl echoed from the rocks above them. The men looked up to see a massive grey wolf perched on a ledge, its yellow eyes fixed on the scene below. Then another growl came from the opposite side of the canyon, and another wolf appeared. This one black as midnight with scars across its muzzle that spoke of countless battles. It was a bluff. The wolves were wild animals who happened to be in the area, drawn by the scent of the horses. But Crenshaw and his men didn't know that. In the growing darkness, with the sound of predators echoing off the canyon walls and a mountain man's rifle pointed at their hearts, their courage began to falter. "What's it going to be?" Ezekiel asked quietly. "Are you going to do the right thing, or am I going to have to make you?" The answer came not in words, but in the metallic click of a key turning in a lock, as Pike, his hands shaking with fear, climbed down from the wagon to free the captive women. Sarah felt the manacles fall away from her wrists, and for the first time in 3 days she could move freely, but she knew this was only the beginning. Freedom was one thing. Surviving long enough to enjoy it was another matter entirely. The chains fell away from Sarah's wrists with a sound like deliverance itself. She rubbed the raw, bleeding skin where the iron had bitten into her flesh, hardly daring to believe that this moment was real. Around her, the other women were helping each other out of the wagon, their movements uncertain and fearful, as if they expected this freedom to be snatched away at any moment. Ezekiel kept his rifle trained on Crenshaw while Pike fumbled with the remaining locks. The scarred man's pale eyes burned with a fury that promised this wasn't over, that he would remember this humiliation and seek revenge for it. But for now, faced with the mountain man's unwavering aim and the growling of wolves in the darkness, he remained still. "Now mount up and ride back the way you came," Ezekiel commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "And if I see any of you on this mountain again, I'll assume you're here to cause trouble for these ladies." Crenshaw's hand twitched toward his gun, and Sarah held her breath. She could see the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of pride against survival. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the canyon held its breath. Then Pike spoke up, his voice high with fear. "Come on, Crenshaw. It ain't worth it. We can find other cargo, but we can't spend money if we're dead." Slowly, reluctantly, Crenshaw raised his hands away from his weapons. "This isn't finished, mountain man," he said, his voice carrying across the canyon like a promise of winter. "Those women represent a significant investment, and my employer doesn't forgive losses lightly." "Then your employer should find a more honest line of work," Ezekiel replied. He gestured with his rifle barrel. "Now ride." The 5 men mounted their horses and rode back up the trail, but Sarah noticed that Crenshaw looked back twice, his scarred face memorizing every detail of the canyon and the man who had humiliated him. She shivered, pulling her torn shawl tighter around her shoulders, understanding instinctively that this rescue had come with a price that would eventually have to be paid. When the sound of hoofbeats had faded into silence, Ezekiel lowered his rifle and turned to face the 5 women. In the growing darkness, illuminated only by starlight and the faint glow of the setting moon, he looked like something out of legend, a frontier angel who had appeared when all hope seemed lost. "Are any of you hurt?" he asked, his voice gentler now than it had been when facing down the slavers. "Do you need medical attention?" The women looked at each other uncertainly. They had been rescued, but by a stranger whose intentions they couldn't be sure of. Sarah found herself stepping forward, becoming their reluctant spokesperson. "We're scared," she said simply, her voice hoarse from days of crying and shouting. "We don't know what happens now." Ezekiel nodded, understanding the fear in her words. "My name is Ezekiel Stone. I live alone up in these mountains, and I give you my word that I mean you no harm." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "You're free now, but you're also in danger. Those men will be back, probably with reinforcements. If you want to survive, you need to get as far away from here as possible." Mary, the farmer's daughter, spoke up with a trembling voice. "We don't have anywhere to go. They took us so far from home, and we don't even know where we are." "You're about 40 miles northeast of Colorado Springs," Ezekiel told them. "If you can make it there, you might be able to find help, maybe even passage back to your families." He looked around the group, taking in their torn clothes, their exhausted faces, their obvious inability to survive a journey through the wilderness. "But you're not equipped for a trek like that. You'd die of exposure before you made it 10 miles. Ruth, the woman with the scars, laughed bitterly. "So we trade one death for another. At least this way we'll die free." Sarah felt despair creeping back into her heart. They had been saved from one horror, only to face another. But as she looked at Ezekiel, she saw something in his pale blue eyes that gave her a spark of hope. "There's another option," he said slowly, as if the words were being pulled from him against his will. "My cabin is about 5 miles up the mountain. It's well hidden, defensible, and stocked with enough supplies to last through winter. You could stay there while we figure out a longer-term solution." "All of us?" Jenny asked, the youngest of the group, hope creeping into her voice for the first time since Sarah had known her. Ezekiel hesitated. Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out across his weathered features. This was a man who had chosen solitude, who had built his life around avoiding exactly this kind of complication. But something, duty, compassion, or perhaps a debt to his own conscience, was compelling him to act against his nature. "All of you," he confirmed, "at least until the immediate danger passes." Elena, who had been silent since their rescue, finally spoke. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you risk your life for strangers? What do you want from us?" It was a fair question, born from experiences that had taught these women to distrust anyone who offered help without an obvious price. Sarah found herself holding her breath, waiting for Ezekiel's answer. He was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "Because 5 years ago I failed to save someone who needed help," he said simply. "And I've been living with that failure ever since. Maybe this is my chance to balance the scales." Sarah felt something stir in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This man, this stranger who had appeared like an answer to prayer, was carrying his own burden of regret. She understood that feeling all too well. "We accept your offer," she said, speaking for the group without asking permission. Somehow, it felt right that she should be the one to make this decision. "And we'll find a way to repay your kindness." Ezekiel shook his head. "No payment necessary, just survival." "That'll be payment enough." He shouldered his rifle and looked around the canyon. "We need to move. Those men might come back with help, and I'd rather not be here when they do." The journey up the mountain was difficult in the darkness. The trail was narrow and treacherous, winding between massive boulders and along the edges of steep drops that vanished into blackness. Ezekiel led the way with the sure-footed confidence of a man who knew every rock and tree route, but the women struggled to keep up. Their soft shoes were no match for the rough terrain, and their weakened condition made every step an effort. Sarah found herself walking just behind Ezekiel, drawn by his steady presence and the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him. She noticed how he occasionally slowed his pace when one of the women began to lag behind, how he offered his hand to help them over particularly difficult passages, how he never showed impatience or irritation despite the slow progress. "How much farther?" Ruth asked during one of their brief rest stops, her voice tight with exhaustion. "About 2 miles, Ezekiel replied. "I know it's hard, but we need to keep moving." "The cabin is hidden in a grove of aspen trees near a small lake. You'll be safe there." As they resumed their climb, Sarah found herself thinking about the whip that Pike had used to control them during their captivity. It was still in the wagon, abandoned along with the chains and shackles that had bound them. She hoped she would never see such instruments of cruelty again. But she understood that the world was full of people like Crenshaw who profited from the suffering of others. But there were also people like Ezekiel Stone, people who would risk everything for strangers, who chose to stand against darkness even when it would be easier to look away. As they climbed higher into the mountains, following this mysterious guardian toward an uncertain future, Sarah allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, her nightmare was finally coming to an end. The mountains seemed to stretch endlessly above them, but with each step she felt a little more of her strength returning. Freedom, she was learning, was not just the absence of chains, it was the presence of choice, the ability to determine your own path forward. And for the first time in days, Sarah Mae Henderson was choosing hope. The cabin appeared out of the darkness like something from a fairy tale, nestled in a grove of white-barked aspen trees beside a small mountain lake. It seemed to blend seamlessly with the natural landscape around it. The logs were weathered to a silver-gray color that caught the starlight, and smoke curled invitingly from a stone chimney. Warm yellow light glowed from 2 windows, promising shelter and safety after the long, harrowing journey. Sarah felt her knees nearly buckle with relief as they approached the wooden door. Behind her she could hear Jenny crying softly, not from despair this time, but from gratitude. They had made it. Against all odds, they had found sanctuary in this wilderness that had seemed so threatening just hours before. Ezekiel produced a simple iron key from his pocket and unlocked the door, gesturing for the women to enter ahead of him. "Welcome to my home," he said quietly, and Sarah caught something in his voice that suggested these might be the first guests he'd welcomed in a very long time. The interior of the cabin was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a main room dominated by a massive stone fireplace where a fire crackled warmly. The walls were lined with shelves holding books, tools, and various supplies, while animal furs served as rugs on the rough-hewn floor. A ladder led up to a sleeping loft, and Sarah could see doorways leading to what appeared to be a bedroom and a storage area. But what struck her most was how clean and organized everything was. This wasn't the rough bachelor's den she might have expected, but a home that had been carefully maintained and thoughtfully arranged. Books were alphabetized on their shelves, tools hung in neat rows, and even the firewood was stacked with military precision. "There's a bedroom back there," Ezekiel said, pointing toward one of the doorways. "It's got 2 beds, not much, but you can make do for now. I'll sleep in the loft." He moved to a large wooden chest and began pulling out blankets and pillows. "You must be hungry. I've got stew on the fire, and there's bread that's only a day old." The mention of food made Sarah realize how long it had been since any of them had eaten a proper meal. During their captivity, they'd been given scraps, barely enough to keep them alive for the journey. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but she also felt a strange reluctance to accept more of this man's generosity. "You don't have to do all this for us," she said, speaking for the group again. "We don't want to be a burden." Ezekiel paused in his distribution of blankets and looked at her directly. "You're not a burden," he said firmly. "You're people who need help, and I have help to give. It's as simple as that." Elena, who had been examining the books on the shelves, turned around with surprise evident on her face. "You have medical texts here," she said, "and books on botany, geology, even philosophy. I was a medic during the war," Ezekiel explained as he ladled stew into wooden bowls. "Picked up the reading habit afterward. Gets lonely up here during the long winters, and books are good company." He handed a bowl to Sarah, their fingers brushing briefly during the exchange. His hands were calloused from hard work, but surprisingly gentle. "What about you? What did you do before?" He stopped himself, seeming to realize that asking about their lives before their capture might be painful. "I helped my father run our farm," Sarah said, accepting the bowl gratefully. "And I taught Sunday school to the children in town. I always loved reading, but we didn't have many books." She tasted the stew and closed her eyes in appreciation. It was simple fare, venison, potatoes, carrots, and onions, but it was the best thing she'd tasted in weeks. As the women ate, Ezekiel busied himself preparing sleeping arrangements and checking the security of the cabin. Sarah noticed how he moved with quiet efficiency, never wasting motion or energy. There was something almost military in his bearing, she thought, a sense of discipline and order that spoke of training and experience. "Were you a soldier?" she asked during a lull in the conversation. Ezekiel nodded, his expression growing distant. "Cavalry scout, fought in the Indian Wars, then stayed on when the regular army needed experienced men." He stirred the fire with an iron poker, sending sparks swirling up the chimney. "Saw enough killing to last several lifetimes. That's part of why I came up here, to get away from all that." Ruth looked up from her stew. "But you were willing to kill those men today to save us." "If necessary," Ezekiel admitted. "But I'm hoping it won't come to that. Violence should always be the last option, not the first." Mary, who had been quiet since they'd arrived, finally spoke. "Do you think they'll come back? Those men who took us?" Ezekiel was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "Probably," he said finally. "Men like Crenshaw don't like being humiliated, and whoever they work for won't want to lose the investment you represented. We need to be prepared for that possibility." The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She had hoped that their rescue meant the end of their ordeal, but she was beginning to understand that it might only be the beginning of a different kind of struggle. "How long can we stay here?" Jenny asked, her young voice small and frightened. "As long as necessary," Ezekiel replied without hesitation. "This cabin has weathered blizzards, bear attacks, and worse. It'll keep you safe while we figure out a permanent solution." Sarah stood up and walked to one of the windows, looking out at the moonlit lake. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the stars like a mirror. It was beautiful and peaceful, but she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there in the darkness, dangerous men were planning their next move. "What's the plan?" she asked, turning back to face Ezekiel. "I mean long-term? We can't hide up here forever." Ezekiel met her gaze, and Sarah saw something in his pale blue eyes that she couldn't quite identify. Respect, perhaps, for her directness and practical thinking. "The nearest telegraph office is in Colorado Springs," he said. "I could ride down there, send messages to your families, let them know you're alive and safe. Maybe arrange for travel funds or escorts to get you home. And if our families can't help?" Elena asked quietly. "Some of us don't have homes to return to." It was a sobering reminder of how completely their lives had been disrupted. Sarah thought of her father, probably drinking himself into oblivion with guilt over what he'd done. Even if she could forgive him, could she ever trust him again? And what about her younger siblings? Did they even know what had happened to her? "Then we'll figure out something else," Ezekiel said firmly. "There are always options. Might not be easy options, but they exist." As the evening wore on, the women began to relax slightly. The warmth of the fire, the safety of the cabin's solid walls, and the simple act of eating a decent meal had begun to restore some small measure of normalcy to their lives. They talked quietly among themselves, sharing stories of their homes and families, beginning the slow process of reclaiming their identities as something more than victims. Sarah found herself drawn repeatedly to observe Ezekiel as he moved around the cabin, tending to various tasks. There was something about him that intrigued her beyond his role as their rescuer. He was clearly educated. The books on his shelves and the way he spoke testified to that. But he had chosen to live alone in the wilderness. He was obviously capable of violence when necessary, but his default manner was gentle and considerate. He was a puzzle, and Sarah had always enjoyed puzzles. When it came time to retire for the evening, Ezekiel handed Sarah the cabin key, a simple piece of iron that somehow felt heavier than its physical weight suggested. "This is your home now, for as long as you need it," he said quietly. "That key means you're not prisoners here. You're guests, and guests should feel secure." Sarah closed her fingers around the key, feeling its warmth from his hand. It was a small gesture, but it carried enormous symbolic weight. For the first time since her father had betrayed her, someone was trusting her with something important. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried all the gratitude she couldn't properly express. As she lay in the unfamiliar bed that night, listening to the gentle breathing of the other women and the distant sound of wind in the aspen trees, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind them. The key lay on the small table beside her bed, catching the moonlight that filtered through the window, a symbol of sanctuary in a world that had suddenly become dangerous and uncertain. But it also represented something else, the possibility of a new beginning, a chance to rebuild her life from the ashes of betrayal and loss. And somehow, that possibility seemed connected to the mysterious mountain man who had risked everything to save a group of strangers. Sarah Mae Henderson fell asleep holding her mother's locket, but dreaming of pale blue eyes and hands gentle enough to offer keys instead of chains. The morning sun painted the aspen grove in shades of gold and green, transforming the lake into a mirror that reflected the surrounding peaks with perfect clarity. Sarah woke to the sound of splitting wood and the smell of coffee brewing over the fire. Through the bedroom window, she could see Ezekiel working methodically through a pile of logs, his movements economical and practiced. She had slept better than she had in weeks, and for the first time since her capture, she felt something approaching peace. The other women were beginning to stir as well, their faces no longer bearing the haunted expressions that had defined their captivity. Jenny was actually smiling as she stretched and yawned, and even Ruth seemed less guarded than she had the night before. "Ladies," Ezekiel called from the main room, "breakfast is ready when you are. We've got eggs from my chickens, bacon from a hog I smoked last fall, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead." The mention of chickens surprised Sarah. She hadn't noticed any livestock the night before. But then again, they had arrived in darkness and exhaustion. As she dressed in the clean clothes, Ezekiel had provided simple but well-made garments that had probably belonged to a woman at some point. She found herself curious about the life he had built for himself in this remote place. Over breakfast, that curiosity began to be satisfied. Elena, whose background as a schoolteacher made her naturally inquisitive, peppered Ezekiel with questions about his daily routine, his supplies, and his preparations for surviving mountain winters. "I keep about 30 chickens," he explained as he refilled their coffee cups. "A milk cow named Bessie, who's gotten cantankerous in her old age, and a vegetable garden that produces enough to supplement what I hunt and trap. The root cellar is stocked with preserved meat, dried beans, and enough flour to last through the worst blizzards." "How long have you lived here?" Mary asked. 5 years this October," Ezekiel replied. "Built the cabin myself the first winter, nearly froze to death doing it. But I learned, adapted, improved things year by year. Now it's as comfortable as any home I've ever known." Sarah noticed that he didn't mention what had brought him to the mountains in the first place, or what he had left behind. There was a deliberate vagueness to his answers when the conversation turned personal, as if certain topics were territory he wasn't ready to explore. After breakfast, Ezekiel gave them a tour of his property. The cabin was part of a larger complex that included a smokehouse, a workshop, a root cellar dug into the hillside, and a small barn where Bessie the cow regarded them with bovine indifference. Everything was built to last, constructed with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of a man who understood that mistakes in the wilderness could be fatal. "You've thought of everything," Sarah observed as they examined the workshop, which contained tools for blacksmithing, carpentry, and leatherworking. "Had to," Ezekiel replied. "Nearest town is a hard day's ride, and that's in good weather. Come winter, you might as well be on the moon for all the help you can expect from the outside world." It was while they were examining his extensive library that Sarah made a discovery that changed her understanding of the man who had saved them. Hidden between a volume on medicinal plants and a treatise on animal husbandry was a small wooden box, and when Ezekiel opened it to show them his medical supplies, something metallic caught the light. "Is that a medal?" Jenny asked with the directness of youth. Ezekiel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Sarah saw his hand move as if to close the box. But then he seemed to make a conscious decision to let them see. He lifted out a tarnished silver medal, suspended from a faded blue ribbon. "Congressional Medal of Honor," he said quietly. "Awarded for actions during the Battle of Slim Buttes." The women stared at the medal in stunned silence. Even Sarah, who knew little about military decorations, understood the significance of what she was seeing. This was the highest award for valor that the United States could bestow, given only to those who had displayed extraordinary heroism in the face of enemy fire. "What did you do?" Ruth asked, her voice hushed with respect. Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes focused on something far beyond the cabin walls. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless, as if he were reciting a report rather than reliving a memory. "My unit was pinned down by Lakota warriors in a box canyon. We'd been there for 6 hours, running low on ammunition and water, with wounded men who couldn't be moved. The Indians had us surrounded, and they were content to wait us out." He paused, his fingers brushing the medal's surface. "I volunteered to create a distraction, to draw their fire while the rest of the unit attempted a breakout." "You went out there alone?" Elena asked, with one other man, Corporal Jimmy Brennan from Boston. Kid was maybe 19 years old, but he had more courage than men twice his age. Ezekiel's voice caught slightly on the name. "The plan worked. We drew enough of their attention that the unit was able to escape with the wounded. But Jimmy..." He stopped, closing the box with a sharp click. Sarah felt her heart ache for the pain she saw in his eyes. "He didn't make it," she said softly. "He got shot trying to reach cover. I carried him for 3 miles through hostile territory, but he died about an hour before we reached safety." Ezekiel returned the box to its place on the shelf. "The medal was supposed to honor our heroism, but all I could think about was how I'd failed to save my partner. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece. Sarah understood now why Ezekiel had chosen isolation, why he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had seen too much. The medal wasn't a source of pride for him. It was a reminder of loss, of a failure that no amount of official recognition could erase. "That's why you helped us," she said, the pieces falling into place in her mind. "You're still trying to save him." Ezekiel looked at her sharply, surprise flickering across his weathered features. Most people, when they learned about his military service, focused on the heroism or the honor. Sarah was the first to understand the guilt that drove him. "Maybe," he admitted. "Or maybe I just couldn't stand by and watch innocent people suffer when I had the power to help." Ruth, who had been listening with growing emotion, stepped forward. "You did save him," she said firmly. "And you saved us too. Jimmy Brennan would be proud of what you did yesterday." "You don't know that," Ezekiel replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, I do," Ruth insisted. "Because good men don't change. If he was brave enough to volunteer for that mission with you, he was the kind of man who would want you to keep fighting for people who can't fight for themselves." Over the following days, as the women settled into the rhythm of life in the mountain cabin, Sarah watched Ezekiel closely. She saw how he would sometimes pause in his work to stare at the peaks in the distance, lost in memories that clearly brought him pain. She noticed how he kept the medal hidden away, but never discarded it, as if he couldn't decide whether it represented honor or shame. But she also saw other things: the gentle way he helped Jenny overcome her fear of the chickens, the patience with which he taught Mary how to identify edible plants, the respect he showed Elena when she offered suggestions for improving the cabin's organization. This was not a man consumed by failure, but one who had allowed grief to overshadow his essential goodness. On the fourth morning of their stay, Sarah woke to find Ezekiel sitting alone by the lake, watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of rose and gold. She approached quietly, not wanting to disturb what seemed like a moment of private reflection. "Mind if I join you?" she asked softly. He gestured to the ground beside him, and she settled down on the rocky shore, pulling her shawl around her shoulders against the morning chill. For several minutes they sat in comfortable silence, watching the day begin in this peaceful corner of the world. "Tell me about your family," Ezekiel said eventually. Before everything went wrong, Sarah was surprised by the request. It was the first time he had asked her anything personal, and she found herself wanting to share her story with him. "My mother was the strongest person I ever knew," she began, her fingers finding the familiar weight of the locket around her neck. "She could birth a calf, teach a Sunday school lesson, and bake bread that would make angels weep, all in the same day. She died of fever 2 years ago, and nothing was ever the same after that. And your father," Sarah's expression darkened. "He was a good man once. Honorable, hard-working, devoted to his family. But losing my mother broke something inside him. He started drinking, gambling, making bad decisions." She paused, struggling with the complexity of her emotions. "I hate what he did to me, but I also remember the father he used to be. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be able to forgive him." "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting," Ezekiel said quietly. "It's about choosing not to let someone else's failures poison your own heart. Is that what you're trying to do? Forgive yourself for Jimmy Brennan." Ezekiel was quiet for so long that Sarah began to wonder if she had overstepped. But finally he nodded. "I've been carrying his death like a stone in my chest for 5 years, he admitted. "Maybe it's time to put that burden down." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the air and stirring the lake into gentle motion, Sarah felt something shift between them. They were no longer just rescuer and rescued, but two people who understood loss and were perhaps ready to help each other heal. The peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching through the trees. Ezekiel was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the rifle that was never far from his reach. Sarah felt her heart leap into her throat as she remembered Crenshaw's promise that this wasn't finished. But as the riders emerged from the aspen grove, Sarah saw that there were only 2 of them, and they didn't have the look of slavers or bounty hunters. They were ordinary cowboys, dusty from the trail and leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. Ezekiel Stone, the older of the two, called out, raising his hand in greeting. "I'm Tom Bradley from the Triple B Ranch down in the valley. We heard you might have some ladies up here who could use help getting back to their families." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and unexpected disappointment. Help had arrived, which meant their sanctuary in the mountains might be coming to an end. But as she glanced at Ezekiel, she realized that leaving this place and this man might be harder than she had anticipated. The story of their rescue was beginning to spread, and with it would come decisions that would determine not just where they would go, but who they would become in the aftermath of their ordeal. The arrival of Tom Bradley and his companion brought news that changed everything. As they sat around Ezekiel's table, sharing coffee and information, Sarah learned that their rescue had become something of a legend in the surrounding settlements. Word had spread quickly about the mountain man who had single-handedly freed 5 women from slavers. And the story had grown in the telling. "Folks are calling you a hero," Bradley told Ezekiel. But the mountain man's expression remained troubled. "The territorial governor has posted a $1,000 reward for information leading to the capture of the men who took these ladies." More importantly, Bradley's companion, a younger man named Pete, added, "We've got responses to the telegrams you sent. Some of these ladies' families are already making arrangements to come get them." Sarah felt her heart sink at this news, though she couldn't entirely explain why. This was what they had all hoped for, a chance to return to their old lives, to put this nightmare behind them. But as she looked around the cabin that had become a sanctuary, she realized that leaving might mean losing something precious that she was only beginning to understand. Elena was the first to receive definitive word. Her sister in New Mexico had arranged for an escort to bring her home, and they would arrive within the week. Mary's parents had sent money for stage passage back to Kansas, along with a letter expressing their joy that she was alive and safe. Even Ruth, who had been so secretive about her past, admitted that she had family in California who would welcome her, but there was no word about Sarah's situation. Her father, it seemed, had disappeared entirely after selling her. The farm had been abandoned, and neighbors reported that Thomas Henderson hadn't been seen since the night his daughter was taken. "I'm sorry," Bradley said, noting Sarah's disappointed expression. "We'll keep trying to locate your family, but for now, it's all right," Sarah interrupted, though her voice betrayed her hurt. "I didn't really expect anything different." That evening, as the other women made plans for their departures, Sarah found herself helping Ezekiel with the evening chores. They worked in companionable silence, feeding the chickens and milking Bessie. But Sarah could feel the weight of unspoken thoughts between them. "You could stay," Ezekiel said suddenly as they walked back toward the cabin. "I mean, if you want to, until you figure out what comes next." Sarah stopped walking and looked at him. In the fading light, his face was difficult to read, but she could hear something in his voice that made her pulse quicken. "Is that what you want?" she asked quietly. Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him struggling with something internal. "I've gotten used to having people around," he admitted finally. "This cabin has felt more like a home in the past week than it has in 5 years. That's not what I asked." He met her eyes then, and Sarah saw something there that took her breath away. "Yes," he said simply, "it's what I want. But I won't ask you to give up your chance at a normal life, to stay in the wilderness with a broken-down soldier." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from a sudden overwhelming surge of emotion. "What if I don't want a normal life?" she asked. "What if I want this life here with you?" The words hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Sarah had surprised herself by speaking so boldly, but she realized that her feelings had been building for days. This man who had risked everything to save her, who carried his pain with such dignity, who had shown her kindness when the world seemed full of cruelty, she was falling in love with him. "Sarah," Ezekiel said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "You don't know what you're saying. You've been through trauma, and sometimes people feel things in situations like this that aren't real. Don't, Sarah said firmly. Don't dismiss my feelings because they're inconvenient or because you think you know better than I do what's in my heart. She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the conflict in his pale blue eyes. I know the difference between gratitude and love, Ezekiel, and I know that what I feel for you is real. He reached up as if to touch her face, then stopped himself. I'm 15 years older than you. I'm a hermit who chose isolation over human contact. I have nothing to offer you except a hard life in the mountains. You have yourself to offer, Sarah replied. And that's everything I want. Before he could respond, she rose up on her toes and kissed him. It was a gentle kiss, soft and tentative, but it spoke of hope and possibility and the courage to reach for happiness, even in the aftermath of pain. When they broke apart, Ezekiel rested his forehead against hers. I never expected to feel this way again, he whispered. I thought that part of me died with Jimmy. Maybe it did, Sarah said softly. Maybe what you're feeling now is something new, something better. Over the following days, as the other women prepared for their departures, Sarah and Ezekiel's relationship deepened. They talked long into the evenings, sharing stories of their pasts, their fears, their dreams for the future. Sarah learned about his childhood on a farm in Ohio, his service in the cavalry, the nightmares that still sometimes woke him in the dark hours before dawn. In return, she told him about her mother's gentle wisdom, her love of reading and teaching, her dreams of having a family and a home filled with love and laughter. She showed him the quilt square she had been working on in her spare time, pieced together from scraps of fabric she had found in his cabin. It's not much, she said, holding up the small square of patchwork. But I thought maybe if I stay, I could make a proper quilt for the bed. Something that would make this place feel more like a real home. Ezekiel took the quilt square in his weathered hands, examining the careful stitches and the way she had arranged the different fabrics into a pleasing pattern. It's beautiful, he said, and Sarah could hear the emotion in his voice. I'd like that very much. Elena was the first to leave, tearfully hugging each of them goodbye and promising to write once she was safely reunited with her sister. Mary followed 3 days later, clutching a small bag of medicinal herbs that Ezekiel had prepared for her journey. Ruth stayed longer than expected, claiming she wanted to help Sarah settle in. But Sarah suspected she was simply reluctant to leave the first place where she had felt truly safe. Jenny was the last to go, and her departure was the most difficult. The young woman had formed a particularly strong attachment to Sarah, viewing her as an older sister who had helped her survive the worst experience of her life. Are you sure you want to stay here? Jenny asked on her final morning, tears streaming down her face. It's so isolated, so far from everything. It's not far from what matters, Sarah replied, holding the girl tightly. And this is where I belong now. As Jenny's escort disappeared down the mountain trail, Sarah felt a chapter of her life closing and another beginning. The cabin suddenly seemed very quiet, with just her and Ezekiel, but it was a comfortable quiet, full of possibility rather than loneliness. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a simple dinner, Ezekiel reached across the table and took her hand. His fingers were rough from years of hard work, but his touch was gentle. I love you, Sarah Mae Henderson, he said, speaking the words like a man making a sacred vow. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to face it with you. Sarah felt her heart swell with joy so pure it almost hurt. I love you too, Ezekiel Stone, and I can't think of anywhere I'd rather build a life than right here in these mountains with you. Outside, the wind sighed through the aspen trees, and the lake reflected the stars like scattered diamonds. Inside the cabin, two people who had found each other in the midst of darkness began to plan a future filled with light. The quilt square sat on the table between them, a small symbol of the home they would build together, carefully crafted, beautiful in its simplicity, and strong enough to provide warmth through the coldest nights. 3 weeks after the last of the rescued women had departed, Sarah was organizing Ezekiel's extensive collection of books when she made a discovery that would change everything she thought she knew about her father's betrayal. Hidden between the pages of a medical text, she found an envelope that had apparently been dropped and forgotten. Her name was written on the front in a familiar, shaky handwriting that made her heart stop. "Ezekiel," she called, her voice tight with emotion. "You need to see this." He emerged from the workshop where he had been crafting furniture for their expanding household. A rocking chair for the porch, shelves for Sarah's growing collection of preserved herbs, a larger dining table to accommodate the family they both hoped to have someday. "What is it?" he asked, noting the pale expression on her face. Sarah held up the envelope with trembling hands. "It's from my father. It was hidden in one of your books. One of the men must have dropped it during the rescue." Ezekiel's expression grew serious. "Are you sure you want to read it? Sometimes it's better to let the past stay buried." "I have to know," Sarah said, though her voice wavered. "I need to understand why he did what he did." With careful fingers, she opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letter was written in Thomas Henderson's familiar hand, but the words were even shakier than usual, as if he had been weeping while he wrote. "My dearest Sarah Mae," she read aloud, her voice breaking slightly. "If you are reading this, then you have survived what I have done to you, and for that I thank God with every breath in my body. I know you must hate me, and you have every right to do so. What I have done is unforgivable, but I pray that someday you might understand why I had no choice." Sarah paused, wiping tears from her eyes before continuing. Ezekiel moved closer, offering silent support with his presence. "They came for me 3 months ago, Crenshaw and his men. But they weren't just after money. They knew about your little brother and sister back in Missouri with Aunt Helen. They knew where they went to school, what time they walked home, how defenseless they were." Sarah's voice caught as the implications became clear. "They told me that if I didn't pay my gambling debts, they would take Robert and little Emma instead. Not to sell Sarah Mae, but to hurt in ways I cannot bear to write on paper." The letter continued in increasingly desperate terms, painting a picture of a man who had been faced with an impossible choice. Thomas had borrowed money from the wrong people, men who trafficked in more than just human cargo. When he couldn't pay, they had threatened not just his life, but the lives of his other children. "I tried everything I could think of," the letter went on. "I sold everything we owned, begged money from every friend and neighbor, even tried to rob a bank, but couldn't go through with it. In the end, they gave me a choice: give them you, or watch them destroy Robert and Emma. I chose to save the children I thought I could protect and sacrifice the daughter I believed was strong enough to survive." Sarah sank into a chair, the letter shaking in her hands. Everything she had believed about her father's betrayal was crumbling, replaced by a more complex and heartbreaking truth. "He thought he was saving them," she whispered. "My brother and sister. He thought he was protecting them." Ezekiel knelt beside her chair, taking her free hand in both of his. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I know this doesn't make what happened to you any easier to bear." "But it does," Sarah said, surprising them both. "Not easier, but different. He didn't sell me for money or because he didn't love me. He sold me because he loved all of us and couldn't see any other way to save the little ones." The letter concluded with words that broke Sarah's heart completely. "I know I am a coward for choosing this path, and I know I will never be able to forgive myself. But if there is any justice in this world, someone will save you as I could not. I pray every night that you will find your way to safety and happiness, even if I can never be part of it. I love you more than life itself, my darling girl, and I am so very sorry. Your father, Thomas Henderson." Sarah folded the letter carefully and sat in silence for several minutes, trying to process this new understanding of her family's tragedy. The anger she had carried for weeks was still there, but it was now mixed with grief for her father's impossible situation and fear for her siblings' safety. "We have to find out what happened to Robert and Emma," she said finally. "If Crenshaw's people are still looking for payment, they're not," Ezekiel interrupted gently. "Tom Bradley mentioned it when he was here. The territorial authorities rounded up most of the slavery ring after our little encounter. Crenshaw himself was killed resisting arrest, and his employer, a man named Marcus Vance, was sentenced to hang. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed immediately by concern. "But what about my father? And the children?" "We'll find out," Ezekiel promised. "I'll ride down to Colorado Springs tomorrow and send some telegrams. If your brother and sister are safe, we'll know soon enough." That night, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with questions and emotions she couldn't untangle. The father she had hated for his betrayal was still the same man, but now she understood the impossible burden he had carried. She thought about the choice he had made, to sacrifice one child in hopes of saving two others, and wondered if she could have done any differently in his position. When morning came, Ezekiel prepared for his journey to town, while Sarah busied herself with household tasks, trying to keep her mind occupied while they waited for answers. But as he was saddling his horse, they heard the sound of approaching riders, more than the one or two visitors they had grown accustomed to. Sarah felt her heart leap into her throat, thinking immediately of Crenshaw's men seeking revenge. But as the riders emerged from the trees, she saw something that made her legs nearly give out beneath her. At the head of the group was a thin, weathered man with graying hair and hollow eyes that she would have recognized anywhere. Behind him rode a woman she didn't know, and between them on a small pinto pony were two children whose faces had haunted her dreams. "Robert! Emma!" Sarah cried out, running toward them with tears streaming down her face. Her younger siblings, now 11 and 9 years old, slid down from their horses and ran to meet her, their faces bright with joy and relief. They had grown in the months since she had seen them, but they were unmistakably the children she had helped raise after their mother's death. Sarah Mae. Emma sobbed, throwing her arms around her sister's waist. "Papa said the bad men took you, but he found a way to get you back." Over their heads, Sarah met her father's eyes. Thomas Henderson looked like he had aged a decade in the few months since she had last seen him. His face was gaunt, his clothes worn and patched, but his eyes held something she hadn't seen there in years. "Hope." "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can you ever forgive an old fool who thought he was doing the right thing?" Sarah looked at this broken man who had made an impossible choice out of love for his children, and she felt her anger finally begin to transform into something deeper and more healing. "Oh, Papa," she said, opening her arms to include him in the reunion. "I already have," as the Henderson family embraced in the shadow of the aspen trees, with Ezekiel watching from a respectful distance and the Colorado peaks standing sentinel over them all. Sarah realized that sometimes the most devastating betrayals could also be the greatest acts of love. The truth had set them all free, but it had also created new challenges that would test the strength of the bonds they were trying to rebuild. The joy of the family reunion was short-lived. As Thomas Henderson explained the circumstances that had brought him to Ezekiel's mountain sanctuary, it became clear that their troubles were far from over. The woman who had accompanied him and the children was Margaret Walsh, a widow from Missouri who had helped Thomas track down his missing daughter. But her presence came with alarming news. "Marcus Vance is dead." "And that much is true," Margaret explained as they gathered around Ezekiel's table. "But his operation was bigger than anyone realized. He had partners, powerful men in Denver and San Francisco, who don't take kindly to having their business disrupted." Ezekiel's expression grew grim as he listened to the details. "What kind of partners?" "Politicians, businessmen, even some territorial officials," Thomas said, his voice heavy with the weight of knowledge he wished he didn't possess. "Men who made fortunes from the suffering of others and who have the resources to make problems disappear permanently." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Are you saying they're coming after us?" "I'm saying they already are," Margaret replied. "There's a bounty on Ezekiel's head, $5,000 for the man who disrupted their most profitable route. And another 1,000 for you, Sarah, because you're a witness who can connect them to Vance's operation." The cabin suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. Ezekiel stood and moved to the window, scanning the tree line with the practiced eye of a man who had learned to recognize danger before it revealed itself. "How much time do we have?" he asked. "Maybe a week," Thomas said. "Margaret and I rode hard to get here ahead of them, but they're not far behind. These aren't common bounty hunters or criminals. They're professionals who have experience hunting people in wilderness areas." Robert, who had been quietly listening to the adult conversation, spoke up with the serious tone of a boy who'd been forced to grow up too quickly. "Papa, are the bad men going to hurt Sarah again?" "Not if I can help it," Ezekiel said firmly, turning from the window to face the group. His pale blue eyes held the cold determination of a man who had made his decision. "But we need to be smart about this. Running won't work. They have resources and manpower we can't match. But this is my territory, and I know every rock, tree, and game trail for 50 miles in any direction." Sarah felt her heart clench with fear, not for herself, but for the man she loved and the family she had just been reunited with. "There has to be another way. Maybe if we contact the territorial authorities." "Some of those authorities are in Vance's pocket," Margaret interrupted. "That's how they've operated for so long without being stopped. They have protection at levels you can't imagine." Emma, sensing the tension in the room, moved closer to Sarah and took her hand. "I don't want to lose you again," she whispered. Sarah pulled her little sister onto her lap, fighting back tears. She had finally found happiness and love in this mountain sanctuary, had been reunited with her family, and now it all threatened to be torn away by the greed and corruption of men she had never even met. "We fight," she said suddenly, surprising everyone with the steel in her voice. "We don't run and we don't hide. We make our stand here and show them that some things are worth defending." Thomas shook his head vehemently. "Sarah Mae, you don't understand what you're saying. These men are killers." "So is he," Sarah interrupted, nodding toward Ezekiel. "And so are you, Papa, when it comes to protecting your family. Maybe it's time we stopped running from bullies and started standing up to them." Ezekiel studied her face, and Sarah could see him reassessing her in light of this new determination. "It would be dangerous," he said quietly. "These men won't show mercy to women or children." "Then we don't give them the chance," Sarah replied. "You said this is your territory. Use that advantage. Set traps, create ambushes, make them come to us on ground we control. Over the next several days, Ezekiel began preparing for what he grimly referred to as the last stand. He had faced overwhelming odds before, but never with so much at stake. Not just his own life, but the lives of the woman he loved and the family she had just reclaimed. His rifle became his constant companion, a .50 caliber Sharps that had served him faithfully through years of frontier life. He cleaned and checked it obsessively, counting his ammunition, calculating angles and distances, transforming the peaceful mountain sanctuary into a fortress. "This gun has dropped elk at 300 yards, he told Sarah as he worked. "Against men, it'll be even more effective." Sarah watched him prepare with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. This gentle man who had saved her, who had shown her such tenderness and love, was transforming back into the soldier he had once been. She could see the change in his posture, in the way he moved, in the cold calculation that replaced his usual warmth. "I need you to take the children to the root cellar when the shooting starts," he said, without looking up from his work. "It's reinforced with stone and timber. It'll stop bullets and provide shelter if the cabin catches fire." "I'm not hiding while you fight for our lives," Sarah said firmly. Ezekiel finally looked up at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Sarah, I can't do what needs to be done if I'm worried about keeping you safe." "Please, no," she interrupted. "I've been a victim, Ezekiel. I was sold like livestock, chained in a wagon, treated like I was nothing more than property. I won't be helpless again." She moved to the gun cabinet and took down a smaller rifle. "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. I may not be as good as you, but I can hit what I aim at." Thomas, who had been listening to this exchange, stepped forward. "She's right," he said quietly. "These men took my daughter once because I was too weak to stop them. I won't make that mistake again." Margaret nodded her agreement. "I can shoot too. Lost my husband to raiders 5 years ago, but not before he taught me how to defend myself." Ezekiel looked around at the faces of these people who had become his family, seeing the determination in their eyes, and slowly nodded. "All right," he said, "but we do this smart. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We use the terrain, we use surprise, and we make every shot count." They spent the remaining time setting traps and preparing defensive positions. Ezekiel showed them how to use the natural features of the mountain, the rocks, trees, and elevation changes, to their advantage. They cached ammunition and supplies in hidden locations, created fallback positions if the cabin became untenable, and established signals for coordinating their movements. Robert and Emma, despite their young age, were given important roles in the plan. They would be the lookouts, positioned in the loft where they could see approaching danger and relay information to the adults below. It was dangerous to involve children in such violence, but Ezekiel recognized that trying to shelter them completely might actually put them at greater risk. On the final evening before the expected attack, Sarah sat with Ezekiel on the shore of the lake, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. The peaceful beauty of the scene seemed to mock the violence that was coming, but it also reminded her of everything they were fighting to protect. "Do you regret staying here?" Ezekiel asked quietly. "You could have gone with Elena or Mary, lived a safe life somewhere far from all this." Sarah took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his life. "The only thing I regret is that it took so long for me to find you," she said. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that these past weeks have been the happiest of my life." Ezekiel squeezed her hand gently. "Mine too," he admitted. "I never thought I'd have a family again, never thought I deserved one. But you've given me something worth fighting for." As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear over the mountain peaks, Sarah realized that tomorrow would determine not just whether they survived, but whether the new life they had built together would endure or be destroyed by the violence of men who saw human beings as nothing more than commodities to be bought and sold. The rifle lay across Ezekiel's lap, a reminder that sometimes the only way to preserve peace was to be prepared for war. And as they sat together in the gathering darkness, Sarah felt a fierce determination growing in her heart. They would not go down without a fight. Dawn came with the deceptive peace of a mountain morning. But Ezekiel had been awake for hours, watching the tree line and listening for sounds that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the wilderness. Sarah found him positioned at the cabin's main window, his rifle resting on the sill, his pale blue eyes scanning the approaches to their sanctuary with the methodical attention of a seasoned soldier. "Anything?" she asked quietly, moving to stand beside him. "Not yet," he replied, but his voice carried the tension of a man who knew that silence could be more ominous than noise. "But they're out there. I can feel them." Robert's voice drifted down from the loft, where he had been keeping watch since before sunrise. Movement in the trees on the north ridge. "Looks like 3 riders, maybe 4. Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "It's starting," he said, his voice taking on the clipped efficiency of command. "Sarah, get to your position. Thomas, check the back approaches. Margaret, make sure the children know to stay low, no matter what happens." As they moved to their assigned positions, Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. The rifle in her hands felt both familiar and foreign. She had learned to shoot as a child, but she had never aimed at another human being. She tried to push down the fear that threatened to overwhelm her, focusing instead on the anger that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her captivity. The attack began with a single gunshot that shattered the morning quiet like breaking glass. The bullet splintered the wooden frame of the window where Ezekiel had been positioned just moments before, but he had already moved to a secondary position behind an overturned table. "They're trying to draw us out," he called to the others. "Don't take the bait. Let them come to us." More shots followed, coming from multiple directions as the attackers attempted to surround the cabin. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from the tree line, but the shooters remained hidden behind rocks and fallen logs. These were professionals, she realized with growing dread, men who knew how to use cover and concealment to their advantage. "Sarah Mae," Thomas shouted from his position near the back door. "Two men trying to flank us from the creek." Sarah swung her rifle toward the indicated direction and saw them, dark figures moving between the trees, using the morning shadows for concealment. Her hands were shaking as she raised the weapon, but she forced herself to remember Ezekiel's training about breathing and sight alignment. The first shot she fired went wide, chipping bark from a pine tree several feet from her target. But the second shot found its mark, and she watched one of the attackers stumble and fall behind a boulder. The sound of her rifle seemed impossibly loud in the confined space of the cabin, and the acrid smell of gunpowder burned her nostrils. "Good shot," Ezekiel called out, but his attention was focused on a more immediate threat. 3 men were advancing on the front of the cabin, moving in short rushes from tree to tree, getting closer with each bound. Ezekiel's Sharps rifle spoke with authority, the heavy .50 caliber bullet punching through the pine log that one attacker had chosen for cover. The man's scream of pain echoed across the mountain clearing, but his companions continued their advance. From the loft, Emma's voice called down in a trembling whisper, "There's more coming from the lakeside. I count at least 5. Sarah felt her stomach drop. They were outnumbered worse than they had anticipated, and the attackers were coordinating their assault to hit the cabin from multiple directions simultaneously. This wasn't a simple revenge mission. This was a military-style operation designed to overwhelm their defenses. "Margaret!" Ezekiel shouted. "Take the lakeside with Robert spotting for you. Thomas, stay on the creek approach. Sarah, help me with the front." The cabin filled with the thunderous noise of multiple rifles firing in rapid succession. Bullets smacked into the log walls with wet, thudding sounds, and glass exploded from the windows as the attackers concentrated their fire. Sarah pressed herself against the wall beside her window, waiting for a lull in the incoming fire before exposing herself to shoot back. When the opportunity came, she rose quickly and fired at a muzzle flash she had seen among the rocks. This time she was rewarded with a cry of pain and the sight of a man stumbling backward, clutching his shoulder. But even as she scored hits on their attackers, Sarah could see that they were in serious trouble. The professional killers had them pinned down and were methodically working their way closer to the cabin. Worse, she could smell smoke beginning to drift through the air. Someone had set fire to the small barn where Bessie was kept. "They're trying to burn us out," Thomas called, having noticed the same thing. Ezekiel's face was grim as he worked the lever of his rifle and sent another devastating shot toward the advancing attackers. "We need to break their momentum," he said. "If they get close enough to surround us completely, we're finished." "What do you need me to do?" Sarah asked, reloading her rifle with hands that were steadier now that the initial shock of combat had passed. Ezekiel looked at her with something that might have been pride mixed with terror. "I'm going out there," he said. "I'll try to get behind them, disrupt their attack. You and the others keep them busy from here." "No!" Sarah grabbed his arm. "It's suicide. There are too many of them. It's our only chance," Ezekiel replied, gently but firmly removing her hand. "These men won't stop until we're all dead. Someone has to break the stalemate." Before Sarah could protest further, Ezekiel was moving toward the back of the cabin, using the smoke from the burning barn as cover. She watched through a crack in the logs as he slipped out the rear door and disappeared into the forest like a ghost. The fighting intensified as the attackers realized that their quarry was trying to escape the trap. Sarah found herself holding the front of the cabin almost single-handedly, firing as quickly as she could reload, while Thomas and Margaret dealt with threats from other directions. Through the chaos of gunfire and shouting, she heard Ezekiel's rifle bark from somewhere in the trees behind their attackers. One of the men advancing on the cabin suddenly pitched forward, and Sarah realized that their guardian angel was already working his deadly magic from an unexpected direction. But the professional killers adapted quickly to this new threat. Sarah watched in horror as 3 of them broke off from the main assault and headed into the forest to hunt down Ezekiel. He was skilled and experienced, but he was also outnumbered 3-1 in terrain that offered as much cover to his enemies as it did to him. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, but the battle showed no signs of ending. Sarah's ears rang from the constant gunfire, and her shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil. Around her, the cabin was taking tremendous punishment. The walls were pocked with bullet holes. The windows were completely shot out, and splinters of wood flew through the air with each impact, but they were still alive, still fighting, and that had to count for something. As Sarah lined up another shot on an attacker who was trying to rush the front door, she found herself thinking of her mother's locket, now hanging around her neck like a talisman. Her mother had faced hardship and tragedy with grace and strength, and Sarah was determined to do the same. The sound of Ezekiel's rifle from the forest had gone silent for several minutes, and Sarah felt fear gnawing at her heart. Had he been killed, captured? Was she about to lose the man she loved just when she had found him? Then she heard it, a sound that chilled her blood and filled her with desperate determination. From somewhere in the trees came a man's scream of agony, followed by Ezekiel's voice shouting something she couldn't make out over the gunfire. The battle was far from over, but Sarah knew that whatever happened next would determine whether their small family survived to see another mountain sunrise, or whether they would join the countless other victims of men who traded in human misery for profit. The silence that followed Ezekiel's distant shout stretched like a held breath. Sarah strained to hear any sound from the forest, but the professional killers had also gone quiet, creating an eerie lull in the battle that somehow felt more threatening than the constant gunfire had been. "Robert," she called up to the loft, "can you see anything?" "2 men are circling back toward the cabin," her brother replied, his young voice steady despite the terror of their situation. "And there's something burning by the lake. Might be their wagon." Before Sarah could process this information fully, the front door of the cabin exploded inward as someone kicked it with tremendous force. A large man with a scarred face and cold eyes stepped through the doorway, a pistol in each hand and a smile that promised violence. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying a cultured accent that seemed out of place in the wilderness setting. "The famous Sarah Mae Henderson. You've caused my employers considerable trouble, young lady." Sarah recognized him immediately, not from personal experience, but from the descriptions the other rescued women had given. This was Vincent Cross, Vance's lieutenant, the man who had been in charge of the entire trafficking operation. He should have been dead or in prison, but here he was, very much alive and seeking personal revenge. "Where's the mountain man?" Cross asked, stepping further into the cabin while keeping his guns trained on Sarah. "I have special plans for him." "He's closer than you think," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady while calculating the distance to her rifle, which was leaning against the wall several feet away. Cross laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I don't think so. My men are quite good at what they do, and Mr. Stone is outnumbered 3-1 in terrain he may know, but which we've been studying for weeks." From the back of the cabin came the sound of Margaret's rifle firing, followed by Thomas shouting something Sarah couldn't make out. The battle was still raging on multiple fronts, but here in the main room, she found herself facing the architect of her nightmares with nothing but her wits and her determination to protect her family. "You know," Cross continued conversationally, "if you had simply accepted your fate, none of this would have been necessary. You would have served your purpose, earned your keep, and eventually found a comfortable situation with a wealthy gentleman in California. Instead, you've cost us a great deal of money and several good men." "Good men don't traffic in human beings," Sarah replied, taking a small step toward her rifle. "Don't," Cross warned, noticing her movement. "I need you alive to draw out your protector, but I don't need you uninjured." At that moment, the window behind Cross exploded inward as Ezekiel Stone came through it like an avenging angel. He moved with the fluid grace of a man who had been shaped by violence, a hunting knife gleaming in his hand. Cross spun to face this new threat, but Ezekiel was already inside his guard, the blade slicing across the killer's gun hand. Cross screamed and dropped one of his pistols, but managed to bring the other one around toward Ezekiel's head. Sarah didn't hesitate. She dove for her rifle, rolled, and came up firing in one smooth motion that would have made her father proud. Her bullet took Cross in the shoulder, spinning him around and spoiling his aim. Ezekiel's knife found its mark a moment later, sliding between the man's ribs with surgical precision. Cross looked down at the blade protruding from his chest with an expression of surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe that his careful plans had come to this. "This is for every woman you destroyed," Ezekiel said quietly. His pale blue eyes holding no mercy, Cross collapsed to the floor, his weapons clattering across the wooden planks. The cabin fell silent, except for the sound of labored breathing and the distant crackle of flames from the burning barn. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, hardly daring to hope. Ezekiel moved to the window and looked out at the clearing. "The others are running," he said. "Without their leader, they've lost their nerve." Thomas appeared in the doorway from the back room, his face streaked with gunpowder and blood from a minor wound on his forehead. "Margaret's hit, but she'll live," he reported. "And the children are safe." Sarah felt her legs give out beneath her as the adrenaline that had sustained her through the battle finally faded. Ezekiel caught her before she could fall, pulling her against his chest and holding her tightly. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "We're safe now." But even as relief flooded through her, Sarah found herself looking at the destroyed cabin, the bullet-riddled walls, the shattered windows, the bloodstains on the floor where Cross had fallen. This place that had been their sanctuary, their home, bore the scars of violence that would never fully heal. "The cabin," she said softly, "can be rebuilt," Ezekiel replied firmly. "What matters is that we're all alive." As if summoned by his words, Robert and Emma came down from the loft, moving carefully around the debris. Emma ran to Sarah, throwing her arms around her sister's waist and crying with relief. "I was so scared," the little girl sobbed. "I thought they were going to take you away again." "Never," Sarah said fiercely, holding her sister close. "Never again." Through the broken windows, they could see smoke rising from several points around the clearing, the barn, what remained of the attacker's wagon, and a small section of forest where stray bullets had ignited the dry undergrowth. It looked like a battlefield, which Sarah supposed it had been, but they had won. Against impossible odds, facing professional killers with superior numbers and resources, they had not only survived, but triumphed. The trafficking ring that had destroyed so many lives was finally broken, its leaders dead or scattered. Margaret limped into the main room, her arm in a makeshift sling, but her expression triumphant. "Well," she said, looking around at the destruction, "I've seen prettier homecomings, but I've never seen a braver family." As the smoke cleared and the immediate danger passed, Sarah realized that this battle had changed them all. They were no longer the broken, desperate people who had sought refuge in the mountains. They had become something stronger, a family forged in fire, bound together by shared trials and mutual sacrifice. The slave wagon that had once carried her toward an unthinkable fate was now nothing but charred wood and twisted metal, destroyed in the same battle that had finally set her free from the shadows of her past. She would never have to fear Crenshaw or Cross or anyone like them again. Ezekiel's rifle lay across the table where he had placed it, still warm from the morning's fighting. It had served them well, this instrument of protection, but Sarah hoped it would never have to be used in anger again. "What now?" Thomas asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. Ezekiel looked around at the faces of the people who had become his family, seeing the love and trust in their eyes, despite everything they had endured together. "Now we rebuild," he said simply. "We make this place a real home for all of us." Sarah felt tears of joy streaming down her face as she realized that her nightmare was truly over. She was free, her family was safe, and the man she loved was offering them all a future filled with hope rather than fear. The mountains would always be a wild and dangerous place, but they would face those dangers together, as a family united by something stronger than blood, a shared commitment to protecting what mattered most. 6 months later, Sarah Mae Stone stood on the porch of the rebuilt cabin, watching the first snow of winter drift down through the aspen trees like scattered prayers. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of a harsh but beautiful season ahead. In her hands, she held a letter that had arrived with the last supply wagon before the passes. Closed for winter, the cabin behind her bore little resemblance to the bullet-riddled structure that had survived the final battle with Vincent Cross and his men. Ezekiel Thomas and a crew of volunteers from the surrounding settlements had worked through the summer and fall to create something that was more than just shelter. They had built a true home. The new structure was larger, with additional rooms to accommodate their extended family. Margaret had decided to stay permanently, claiming that mountain life suited her better than the civilized world ever had. Robert and Emma had their own small rooms, furnished with handcrafted furniture that Ezekiel had made during the long summer evenings. Most importantly, the cabin now bore the touches that transformed a bachelor's wilderness retreat into a family home. Sarah's quilts on the beds, her preserved herbs hanging from the kitchen rafters, and books scattered on every available surface. The letter in her hands was from Elena, writing from her new home in New Mexico with news of the other women who'd been rescued that night on the mountain trail. Mary had married a young pastor in Kansas and was expecting her first child. Ruth had opened a boarding house in California, providing safe haven for other women escaping difficult circumstances. Jenny, the youngest, had returned to school and was planning to become a teacher. "They're all safe," Sarah said aloud, though she was alone on the porch. It had become a morning ritual for her, reading the letters from their scattered sisters and offering a prayer of gratitude for their continued well-being. The sound of axes biting into wood echoed from the forest where Ezekiel and Thomas were cutting firewood for the winter. The two men had developed an unlikely friendship over the months, bonded by their shared devotion to Sarah and their mutual understanding of the mistakes that could haunt a man's soul. Thomas had found his sobriety in the clean mountain air and honest work, while Ezekiel had discovered that forgiveness, both given and received, could heal wounds that had festered for years. "Sarah," Emma's voice called from inside the cabin. "The bread is ready." Sarah smiled and folded the letter carefully before going inside. The warmth of the kitchen enveloped her, redolent with the smells of fresh bread and the venison stew that had been simmering all morning. Emma, now 10 years old and growing tall, stood proudly beside the wood-burning stove where 4 perfect loaves cooled on wooden racks. "Papa said we could make extra to take to the Mackenzie family," Emma announced. "Their youngest is still sick with that cough." "That's very thoughtful," Sarah replied, ruffling her sister's hair. The child had grown confident and happy in their mountain home, losing the haunted look that had marked her during the terrible journey to find Sarah. Both children had adapted to mountain life with the resilience of youth, learning to fish in the lake, identify animal tracks, and even help with the simpler aspects of running the household. Robert entered from the main room, where he had been working on his lessons. At 12, he was beginning to show signs of the man he would become: serious, responsible, but with a quick smile and a gentle humor that reminded Sarah powerfully of their mother. "Ezekiel wants to know if you finished the letter to the territorial governor," he said, wiping ink from his fingers. "He's planning to ride down to Colorado Springs next week if the weather holds." Sarah nodded, thinking of the carefully worded correspondence that sat on Ezekiel's desk. They had been working for months to ensure that the remains of Vance's trafficking network were completely dismantled, providing testimony and evidence to help convict the remaining conspirators. It was difficult work, requiring Sarah to relive the worst experiences of her life, but she understood its importance. Every conviction meant fewer women would suffer as she had suffered. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her thoughts. Through the kitchen window, she could see 2 riders emerging from the tree line, Ezekiel and Thomas returning from their morning's work. Both men looked healthy and content, their faces tanned by mountain sun, and their movements speaking of the deep satisfaction that came from honest labor. As they cared for their horses and stacked the split wood, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had been a desperate captive, chained in a wagon and facing a fate worse than death. Now she was a wife, a sister, a daughter who had been given the chance to forgive and be forgiven. The wedding had taken place in late summer, performed by a traveling preacher who visited the mountain settlements twice a year. It had been a simple ceremony, attended by their small family and a few neighbors who had become friends. Sarah had worn a dress she had sewn herself from fabric ordered from Denver, and Ezekiel had presented her with a ring he had crafted from a silver dollar in his workshop. But the most meaningful moment of the ceremony hadn't been the exchange of vows or rings. It had been when Thomas, with tears streaming down his weathered face, had placed Sarah's hand in Ezekiel's and whispered, "Take care of my little girl." The forgiveness implicit in that gesture had healed something in all of them that had been broken by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The kitchen door opened, bringing a swirl of cold air and the sound of masculine laughter. Ezekiel and Thomas entered, stamping snow from their boots and hanging their coats on pegs beside the door. "Smells like heaven in here," Ezekiel said, moving to Sarah's side and wrapping his arms around her from behind. She leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart and the solid warmth of his presence. "Margaret should be back from the Mackenzie place soon," Sarah said. "She went to check on little Timothy's cough." "Good," Thomas replied, settling into his chair at the table. "That boy's been fighting that illness for too long. Mountain winter's no time to be sickly." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses announced Margaret's return. She entered the kitchen with snow in her grey hair and a satisfied expression on her face. "The boy's fever broke," she announced without preamble. "Should be back on his feet within the week. His mother sends her thanks for the medicine and the extra food." This too had become part of their lives, serving as unofficial caregivers and good neighbors to the scattered families who made their living in the harsh but beautiful wilderness. Ezekiel's medical training, combined with Sarah's knowledge of herbs and Margaret's practical nursing experience, had made them invaluable to their small community. As the family gathered around the table for their midday meal, Sarah looked at each face illuminated by the warm glow of the oil lamps. Emma was chattering about a story she was writing, while Robert listened with the patient attention of an older brother. Thomas and Margaret were debating the best methods for preserving meat through the winter, and Ezekiel was quietly observing them all with the expression of a man who had found something he had never expected to possess, a sense of belonging. On the shelf beside the table sat Sarah's most treasured possessions, her mother's silver locket, now joined by a worn Bible that she and Ezekiel read from each evening. These objects represented the foundation of their life together, faith, family, and the memory of love that had survived even the darkest times. After the meal, as the family dispersed to their afternoon tasks, Sarah and Ezekiel walked out to the shore of the lake. The water was beginning to show a skin of ice around the edges, and the surrounding peaks were white with snow that would not melt until spring. "Any regrets?" Ezekiel asked, taking her mittened hand in his. Sarah considered the question seriously, looking back over the year that had transformed her from a broken victim into a woman who had found strength she never knew she possessed. The trauma of her captivity would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it had become the foundation for something beautiful, a marriage built on mutual respect and deep love. A family reunited and strengthened by adversity, and a home where healing was possible. "None," she said firmly. "Not a single one." As they stood together watching the snow fall on their mountain sanctuary, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain as all futures must be, but bright with possibility. There would be challenges, harsh winters, difficult seasons, the ordinary struggles of life in a demanding environment. But they would face those challenges together, As a family forged in trial and tempered by love, the mountains that had once seemed like prison walls now felt like protective barriers, sheltering them from a world that could be cruel and unpredictable. Here, in this remote valley beside a crystal-clear lake, they had found something that no amount of money could buy and no act of violence could destroy. A home built on love, forgiveness, and the unwavering conviction that some things were worth fighting for. As the early winter darkness began to fall and the warm lights of their cabin beckoned them home, Sarah Mae Stone understood that sometimes the most beautiful destinations could only be reached through the darkest journeys. She had been sold into slavery by the father she loved, saved by a stranger who became her husband, and transformed by trials that had revealed strength she never knew she possessed. Now, with snow falling softly around them and the promise of a warm hearth waiting inside, she was exactly where she belonged, home at last, surrounded by love, and free to write the next chapter of her story on her own terms.